But Dr. John Mark Nielsen is the Executive Director Emeritus from the Museum of Danish America. And he is also Emeritus Professor from Dana College out in the same end of the woods. John Mark has been studying in Denmark also. He has been lecturing at colleges in Denmark. He has even been lecturing in India, in southern India, Hindu India, but probably in English. He has been Professor of the Year several times, and John Mark was one of the kingpins in getting what used to be the Danish Immigrant Museum, that now has the name of Museum of Danish America. But to get the Danish Immigrant Museum started, the Immigrant Museum out in Elkhorn, Iowa, John Mark was very influential in that, and he ended up being the executive director for the museum for 15 years. John Mark? 15 and a half years, yes. In 2012, John Mark was knighted by Queen Margrethe II, and he received the cross by the ambassador in Washington a few months after. So there is a lot more to say, but now John Mark is going to say it himself. So John Mark.
Thank you, Peter. And I'm not going to talk about myself. There's great relief. I would like to begin by inviting you to imagine that you are Danish immigrants. But the year is 1914. It's summer 1914, and you're an immigrant working out on a farm. Maybe you're married, and you and your husband or you and your wife are trying to make a go of it out on the Great Plains. And you know how sometimes challenging that can be. But it's summer. It's July 9th, 1914 to be exact. Why? Because that happens to be the date of an issue of the Danske Pioneer, the Danish Pioneer, printed July 9th, 1914. And from its offices in Omaha, Nebraska, it is taken down to the post office. Actually, thousands of copies, 40,000 copies, are taken down to the post office and shipped out across the country. There are over 100,000 Danish immigrants reading the Danske Pioneer, the Danish Pioneer. It is a paper that joins the community together. And you, remember, you're out on the farm, you're waiting for the delivery of your Danske Pioneer. It was public, and it's not something we wait every other week, as is today, but it was published every week. 12 pages, a broadsheet in its makeup, 8 columns. There are no pictures. There are no headlines. It's just a lot of text. And it's a lot of text in what the Danes say, gotiske, the Gothic script. And you're waiting for your paper. And it comes. And what do you find in it? Remember, it's July 9th, 1914. Across the front is the Inlandsnews and Udlands. We have national news, 4 columns, and we have international news, 4 columns. And at the top of that 5th column, right underneath the banner headline, the story. No headline, but the banner, Den Danske Pioneer, and underneath just a bolded title, Death in Sarajevo. Because, as many of you may remember or may know, On June 28th, 1914, Archduke Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated in the streets of Sarajevo. And so that's a story in the newspaper. And then also, on that same page is a story about the wheat harvest on the Great Plains. The news is being brought to those of us who are immigrants living on the plains. And as we turn the pages, what do we find? We find on the second page stories from different of the Danish communities around the United States. It wasn't always the same with every issue, but in the July 9th, 1914 issue, there's a story from Perth Amboy, New Jersey, the community there. There's a story from Detroit, Michigan, and there's a story from Clinton, Iowa. And we keep turning the pages. On the third page is news devoted to Sarajevo, the south of Jutland, still under German rule. This is, remember, before 1920, before the plebiscite. It's stories about the Danish community in the south of Jutland. And then on the fourth page, we have the editorials. And the editor is identified, and in this case, it was a rather tame editorial because Sophus Nebel, the publisher and editor at that time, focused on the golden wheat harvest that was beginning to occur across the American Midwest. We keep turning the pages, and on page 5 is news from Denmark. Full story, columns. On to page 6, news from Chicago, takes up a full page. Page 7, news from Omaha, takes up a whole page. In fact, I can tell you that there's more news in that 1914 issue on Omaha than there is today in the Omaha World Herald about Omaha. And then we turn the pages, and there are 2 novels being serialized. So I think there were 4 chapters of each novel, one on one page, one on the next page. And then to page 11, we've got 3 stories, gripping titles: A Murder, The Yellow Automobile, there's poetry, and on the last page is the farm journal, discussing different aspects of farming. So one newspaper published once a week, but coming out and communicating to we immigrants. I think about what it must have been to live on a farm at that time, and you're tired at night, but finally you sit down with your Pioneer and you read, and there's enough in that one issue of the Danske Pioneer to keep you reading for a week and waiting for the next one to come. That's the kind of newspaper the Danske Pioneer was at the beginning of the 20th century. Sent out, as I said, to 40,000 addresses and read by over 100,000, fully over a third of the Danish immigrant population here in the United States. It's an incredible story. Why do I say this? Why do I bring this up? Because you too can read these newspapers. They are available online. At the Museum of Danish America, we were able to digitize them with help from the AP Møller Fund. And you can go to the website of both the Museum of Danish America and the Danish Library and Archive in Blair, and you can access these papers. And even if you don't read Danish, and even if it's difficult for you to make out the Gothic script, it's fun to read the advertisements. Advertisements to saloons and tobacco shops. And it's kind of fun to see the farms for sale and where there might be jobs available. Again, underscoring how this was a vehicle to the community. Well, I like to speak extemporaneously. However, I have a problem with that, because the last time I did, I went on for an hour. So I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to move to a manuscript now. Today, we celebrate the Danske Pioneer, and in many ways, the amazing fact that it alone of all, and you know what? There were 96 different newspapers published in Danish across the country over the years. 96. Of all these Danish American newspapers, this is the one to reach its 150th year, the only one continuing to exist today. How is it? How is and why? I think much has to do with the dedication and perseverance of the individuals and families who have owned and published the Danske Pioneer. Incredibly, this has been the result of the founder, Mark Nielsen, and 3 families, Sophus Rebild and his family, Hjalmar Bertelsen and his wife Helena, and Chris Steffensen, his wife Elsa, and their daughters Linda and Elizabeth. And John, I know you're involved too, but I think they're the most active. It is also true that each have been aided by important and loyal staff. It is, however, their vision and dedication that has kept the Danske Pioneer rolling off the presses and serving as an important publication linking the widely scattered Danish American community here in North America. And each of them have fascinating stories, which I can go on at some length about, but I will try to compress it. In 1872, Mark Nielsen, a Danish immigrant from a village southwest of Kolding, walked into the offices of Edward Creighton in Omaha. Some of you know Creighton University in Omaha. Creighton was the wealthy builder of the first telegraph from Omaha to the Pacific coast, and had made a fortune in that telegraph operation. And Nielsen needed money to start a newspaper that would counter the voice of the Nebraska Scandinavian, another Danish newspaper in Omaha that had been started the year before, but it was a mouthpiece for the Republican Party, and Nielsen was a Democrat and wanted a party newspaper for his party. Nielsen, the founder, was an entrepreneur and an adventurer, a veteran of both the First Schleswig War of 1849 and 1850 and the American Civil War. He and his wife had converted to the Mormon faith by Mormon missionaries in Denmark in the early 1850s, and they had been part of the Mormon migration. But he got out west to Utah and discovered that as a Dane, he was not going to be able to rise in the leadership of the church that he had hoped to become a more leading figure. And so they left the church, and he returned back to Omaha and entered into many ventures, running a store, and of course founding the Danske Pioneer. But also he went on in 1882, 10 years after the founding of the newspaper, to found the Danish Brotherhood in America. So another important organization in the Danish American experience here. Well, Mark Nielsen was not a journalist, but he hired individuals to run newspapers and directed them on what to write and what editorial positions to take. Consequently, when Sophus Rebild, a young 21-year-old printer's apprentice from Stuvekøbing Falster, arrived in Omaha in September 1883, he was immediately hired. Not only did Nielsen hire Rebild, but he promised that if Rebild did well, he would advance Rebild the money to bring his fiancée, Christina, over from Denmark. 6 months later, in March 1884, Hansen made good on his promise, and Sophus and Christina were married as soon as she got off the train in Omaha. They weren't going to live in sin. Within 3 years, on July 1st, 1887, Hansen sold the newspaper to Sophus Rebild. Through the 1880s and 1920s, these were years of major immigration from Denmark, and Rebild took advantage of this, expanding the coverage, upgrading the printing presses, and overseeing the growth of subscribers. This, despite losing his wife Christina and 3 of their 6 children within a week of one another in 1901. By 1902, the paper had a mailing list of over 25,000 addresses with an estimated readership of approaching 100,000, and by 1914, it reached its peak of 39,913 subscribers. The growing success led Rebild to build his own 2-story building in 1903, a building that still exists in Omaha today. Visit, and I'll take you down there and show it to you. Many factors contributed to the Pioneer's growth. Important to immigrant readers was coverage of Danish news. Additionally, Rebild did not shy away from political and religious debates that engaged readers. He considered himself a radical liberal, aligning himself with the Radikal Venstreparti in Denmark and the Democratic Party here in the United States. Editorial positions inflamed church members here in this country, resulting in the creation of several other newspapers. Den Dannevirke, which was a Grundtvigian newspaper founded, interestingly enough, in Elkhorn, Iowa, and Danske, founded in Blair, a more pietistic newspaper. He also ran into some problems in his editorial stance regarding the Danish king and the government dissolving parliament during the 1880s and 1890s and ruling as a minority government, and so the paper was banned in Denmark. Well, I think we know if something is banned, it becomes even more interesting, and subscriptions in Denmark actually rose. Rebild's advocacy for building relations between Denmark and the United States led him to join with Max Henius and be an early supporter of the effort to establish the park in the Rebild Hills south of Aalborg, which he promoted in the pages of the Pioneer. And as World War I ended, he and the paper vigorously campaigned for the plebiscite that resulted in the return in 1920 of part of Slesvig to Denmark. And just as an aside, President Wilson, in his campaign for his second term in 1916, visited Omaha, Nebraska. And in his tour of Omaha, he stopped at and visited the offices of the Danske Pioneer. And I wonder, because you remember that Denmark was neutral in World War I wonder if there was, in that contact, he remembered that when the Treaty of Versailles was being worked out, and the Danes, who were neutral, were advocating for the plebiscite. I wonder if it wasn't Danish Americans who were also very much engaged in that political advocacy. In fact, I know it was, because if you look at an issue of the Danske Pioneer from March of 1920, we have quite an interesting editorial by Jens Jensen, the famous landscape architect here in Chicago, advocating for Danes, if they still could, to go back to Denmark and vote to see that as much as Slesvig came back to the Kingdom of Denmark. Well, in recognition of his efforts, he was invited to be the American guest speaker in 1925 at Rebild, and that same year he was made a Knight of Dannebrog. However, his health was failing, and as 1931 came to a close, Nebel died following his third heart attack. Despite Nebel's advice to his second wife to sell the Pioneer, Olivia refused to do so, and with her husband's son Ivan and Sophus's brother, they continued to carry on publication of the Pioneer. And as unrest grew in Europe, and then with Nazi Germany's occupation of Denmark in 1940, there was continued interest in the Danish American community for news specifically from Denmark, allowing the paper to maintain subscription levels. However, with the end of the war, it became increasingly difficult to operate. In a farewell editorial published on June 26, 1958, Olivia wrote that the paper was closing due to, and I quote, age, poor health, and lack of manpower. Many of the older Danish printers had died, and it was harder to find individuals to work on the staff. On July 10, 1958, the last issue of Den Danske Pioneer was published in Omaha, 27 years after Sophus Nebel's death. There was, however, hope of new life for Den Danske Pioneer. A group of Chicago investors, led by Hjalmar Bertelsen, raised funds to purchase the paper from the Nebel family. On October 16, 1958, after a gap of 3 months, the first issue of the Pioneer was published by the Bertelsen Publishing Company of Elmwood Park, Illinois. In the first editorial, Bertelsen thanked the Nebel family for their work and made it clear that many Danish American organizations had expressed continued need for a paper to communicate with others across the country. Bertelsen, like Hansen and Nebel before him, was a Danish immigrant. Born in Halland, Vendsyssel, he had trained as a typographer and had worked in Aalborg and Bijla before his wife Helena and their daughter immigrated to the United States in 1928. Ultimately, they settled in Elmwood Park, where he founded Elmwood Park Press. Both Hjalmar and Helena were avid supporters of the Rebild National Park Society. Hjalmar was proud of the fact that as a boy of 14, he had sold programs at the first Rebild Fest in 1912. In 1956, he published a history of Rebild, and at that year's Rebild Fest, both he and his wife were named Aalborg's mayor and mayoress for a day, the first time that had occurred. Following this and his efforts to revive the Pioneer, it is not surprising that in 1960, Hjalmar was named a Knight of Dannebrog, and later in 1972, Prince Henrik elevated him to Knight of Dannebrog First Class. Bertelsen was responsible for important changes to Den Danske Pioneer. Editorials disappeared. There was an increase of photography, and the news from Denmark shied away from politics and focused more on royalty, celebrities, Danish design and products, and of course, travel to Denmark and news from Danish American organizations across the country continued to dominate the content. He also took advantage of opportunities to bring Danish students as trainees to the newspaper. These changes brought about an increase in advertising and subscriptions. It was Bertelsen's hope, though never realized, that the paper would go back to being published weekly as it had in Omaha, but it continued to be published every other week. Following Hjalmar Bertelsen's death on December 30th, 1981, another Danish immigrant, Chris Steffensen from Vindrup, Vestjylland, was named Pioneer's managing editor. Educated in business at Aarhus Handelshøjskole, Chris had worked in the wholesale food industry. In 1958, he married Elsa Johansson, who was from Silkeborg, and for their honeymoon, they immigrated to America, settling in Chicago. It was here that their 4 children, Robert, John, Linda, and Elizabeth, were born. And here, for 20 years, Chris worked for Noon Hour Food Products, and Elsa for Bennett Travel Bureau. During the 7 of these years, Chris also served as secretary for the Danish Businessmen's Club of Chicago. In 1984, he and Elsa purchased Bertelsen Publishing Company and moved in Danske Pioneer to their home in Hoffman Estates, Illinois. Though he had no training as a journalist, Chris was a people person. He knew many of the members of the Danish American organizations across the country. And I can testify to this because I worked with him on the board of the Danish Immigrant Museum. As Elsa said when I interviewed her, quote, Chris really blossomed when he became editor. He loved the contact with people, and he thrived on meeting others and bringing people together. Chris and Elsa also benefited from their daughter Linda's interest in the newspaper. As Linda said, and I quote, going to the meetings of the many Danish organizations with my parents brought me closer to them and inspired my interest in the many organizations in Chicago, across the country, and in Denmark, unquote. This interest led Linda to earn degrees in journalism, marketing, and communication. In 1997, in recognition of the 125th anniversary of Den Danske Pioneer and his service to the Danish American community, Chris received the Order of Dannebrog from Her Majesty Queen Margrethe II. As with the Nabel family in 1941, following Chris's death on October 4th, 2001, Elsa and the family were determined to continue publication of Den Danske Pioneer. Elsa became the publisher and kept the financial records, and Linda became the editor. Quote, she says, I've had the rare opportunity to work with both my parents for 40 years, 20 with my father, and now 20 with my mother, unquote. As their daughter Elizabeth has had more time, and her mother has grown a little older, but just a little, Elizabeth has taken over the business operations. Quote, then this is what Elsa has to say, my daughters let me have 2 pages. The news from Denmark on page 2, and smil, or smile, on the last page. Reflecting on the 40 years the Stephenson family has been involved with publication of Den Danske Pioneer, Elsa's comment was, I don't think we've sacrificed. It's been dedication, unquote. Mark Hansen, Sophus Niebel and family, Hjalmar and Helena Bertelsen, Chris, Elsa, Linda and Elizabeth Stephenson, and the many others have contributed to the success of Den Danske Pioneer. Today, we celebrate them, but especially the Stephenson family and their efforts that have brought us to this 150th anniversary. So I think it would be appropriate if you would please stand and join me in remembering Chris and celebrating Elsa, Linda, and Elizabeth and the Stephenson family with a rousing threefold hurrah. Hip, hip, hurrah! Hip, hip, hurrah! Hip, hip, hurrah! And I thank you. Now the next issue of the Pioneer can say I had a standing ovation at my speech. Thank you.
Thank you, John Mark. This was great. What a great story we had here. And he or she who claims that they knew it all, raise their hand. Now is the time to ask Linda Stephenson to come up here. We are running short on time. I have been looking seriously at John Mark for a while. Linda will be easier, but we needed all that stuff, didn't we? Yes.